One of my lasting memories of the pandemic is that my sister had 2 children during that time. And she asked me to come out and baptize both of them. The first was in the summer of 2020. Now, if you remember that time, you remember we knew very little about what was happening. We didn't really know how the virus was shared, transmitted. We didn't even have a vaccine then. And so I remember my family bought a camper, because that seemed to be what we all did in the summer of 2020. And I remember we stayed in that camper in my sister's driveway. We didn't even go into the house. And her child was baptized in the swimming pool in her backyard with just family around. 18 months later, she had another child, and that baby was baptized in the church that I grew up as a part of, Aldersgate United Methodist. And I remember there was lots of people there. It was during the worship service. It was this big ta-da. Is one baptism better than the other? Is one baptism more real than the other? Does one count and the other doesn't? We bring these kinds of questions when we talk about what does it mean to be born again, to be born anew. Jesus and the disciples are in the garden, or not in the garden, they're in a olive grove. And they've had a long day. They're very tired. And I want you to imagine that they've had their fish, and the fire that grilled that fish is now down to the embers. It's just kind of percolating there. The stars are out. Jesus is just lying next to the fire, his eyes closed, relaxing. I want you to imagine that Peter and Andrew and John, they're over here. Maybe they're smoking a pipe. They're just kind of relaxing in the midst of it, while Matthew and Thomas and Judas, they're over here maybe having a little bit of an argument about politics and wanting to be quiet, not to upset the Thunder Brothers or not to disturb Jesus from his rest. And in the middle of that, they hear these twigs start to break in the grove as someone comes towards them. And out of the darkness emerges a priest. And not just any priest, a high priest named Nicodemus. Nicodemus is a religious leader of this day and age. He's a professional theological expert. He is properly educated. He's respected. He has a reputation among the Jewish people. And he's coming under the cover of darkness because Jesus is a troublemaker. Jesus has gotten the Jews to stand against the religious status quo. He's got the Jews and the Romans wrapped up in conflict with one another, and he has spoken against the religious leaders, specifically Nicodemus. And so to be seen with Jesus is going to risk his reputation. But for Nicodemus, something is missing. Something he needs fulfilled. He stumbles to Jesus and he's so nervous. He starts with this compliment. I know you're from God. But I think Jesus is so exhausted that flattery isn't really going to work for him. Jesus says, you don't know me. You don't know anything about me except what you've seen me perform, the miracles in the temple. But you don't even know about faith, Nicodemus, for you slip in here at night. Faith involves risk and commitment, and you have neither. Jesus, I came here for a serious conversation, Nicodemus says. My reputation is at risk. Don't tell me I'm not putting it all on the line. And you want to speak to me in riddles? I'm pushing retirement age. How am I supposed to be born again? Now, I want to say, I don't experience Jesus and Nicodemus as being hostile to one another. Have you ever come home from a long day and realized you and the people you live with are not in the same emotional space? right? That's what's happening here. Jesus and Nicodemus are not in the emotional space. Jesus is exhausted and Nicodemus is terrified. Jesus answers him, unless you're born anew, you won't have faith. Nicodemus is wanting something much more solid than this. Metaphors aren't working for him right now. And he says, Jesus continues, there's nothing you can do to birth yourself. It is only something God does in you. But Nicodemus didn't get any of this that night. And so he leaves the olive grove confused and alone. How many of us come here because we're searching for that connection to something infinite beyond ourselves, recognizing that we can only do so much? We're limited in our ability to enact change in the world. We're limited by how much justice we can bring about. We're limited by others, family members, addictions, resistance, realities. We're limited by systems and institutions, and we are limited by ourselves. We only have so much control, and at some point, God, we need you to do what we cannot. I was sitting in my office when I got a call that there was somebody at the front who wanted to speak to a pastor. This happens routinely. I went up and the gentleman said, I need to be baptized right now. And I was a little taken aback because that isn't actually a common occurrence. We don't get that request from people just walking off the street. And I said, why do you need this so suddenly, thinking maybe he had been given a terminal diagnosis or he was getting ready to leave in the army to ship out, or he had some conviction of heart. And he said, I need the good water poured over me again. Again, I thought. It isn't really our theology as a United Methodist Church. How many times have you been baptized? Oh, at this point, probably a dozen. Well, I would advise you to consider it might not be taking if we're doing it over and over again. He said, but I keep messing up and I need a do-over. Baptism is not something we do over. We believe that once you are dipped, you are in. Once you accept the grace of God, you are saved forever and always. It's a ritual I believe we only need once. God doesn't just leave it and leave you, and it needs to be redone. And while I believe that, it is still very hard for me to say to someone who earnestly wants that do-over, who wants to have a different experience. But that's not how we understand the power of that sacrament. And so I get Nicodemus' frustrations of, Jesus, just give me what I need to have the do-over. I get this man's frustrations, just re-baptize me, put a little water on me, and I'll have the do-over. We come here to be transformed, to be led to a new life. And here's the real truth about being born again. It's not a do-over. It doesn't erase your baptism. It doesn't erase your mistakes. It's a shift. Nothing needs to be redone. It's God doing something in you. We try to undo what God has done, and that isn't what it means to be born again. I think, like Nicodemus, we are so often prepared to meet a God of retribution, not a God that extends grace. We're ready for a God who's going to drive a hard bargain, not the God who's going to pay you for a full day's wage, even though you only worked for a few hours. And so as Nicodemus leaves that olive grove, confused and alone and isolated and unsure what to do next, is when John writes these words, "For God so loved the world." Eugene Peterson has rewrote it for us in this way: God didn't go to all the trouble of sending God's Son merely to point an accusing finger telling the world how bad it was. Jesus came to help. Jesus came to put the world right again. Jesus is the reminder to us in our olive grove places that God isn't done with you yet. It's the reminder to Nicodemus, God isn't done with you yet. I love the story of Nicodemus because I am 100% unsure about this born again thing. I think it has a tendency to be manipulative. I question if it is necessary, and in many ways, it reduces grace to this fleeting moment and not the transformative power I know grace to be. I love this story because at its heart, it says no matter where you are at faith, God's not done with you. Maybe you've made a declaration of faith. God's not done with you. Maybe Jesus is challenging you, like Nicodemus, to go deeper. God's not done with you. Maybe you don't have this faith thing figured out. God is not done with you yet. Nicodemus leaves that olive grove alone and confused, but God was not done with him yet. Because in the words of Paul Harvey, we have to know the rest of the story, which is that Nicodemus will be one of the religious leaders who at the end, when Jesus is on trial, will stand up and say, no, that man is innocent. Nicodemus will be one who will take Jesus' broken body down from the tomb and prepare it for burial. Nicodemus will have a transformation. He will be born again because God is not done with you yet. Amen.